Okay. Afternoon, everybody. Phil Brunner here again, Bailiwick Legal, for our November issue of Facebook Live. Um, okay, so usual story, or script, I should say. The information contained in my presentation is provided for information purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice on any matter. A bit about Bailiwick Legal. Bailiwick is a company that we formed about 7.5 years ago now to specialise in agribusiness, and over the last couple of years we've also partnered with the Tourism Council, and we deal in tourism law as well. So, what is that? That covers the whole gambit of commercial, contractual, transactional law issues, agency law, corporate, property, estate, and business successions, and I could keep going on. Part of what we do too is employment law, and today's topic sort of fits well within that. If viewers can recall, I can't remember whether it was 2 or 3 months ago, I did a Facebook Live which we called No Jab, No Job. As events have turned out with COVID and government regulation, the No Job, No Jab concept has really taken off in more senses than one. To the extent now that we actually have, as no doubt viewers would be aware, a situation where the state government has mandated vaccinations across particular industries. The focus of that has been to push the responsibility, and I'll say it in that respect, that's how I see it, push the responsibility of ensuring at least employees are vaccinated, pushing that responsibility onto employers through mandatory COVID process where employers can be audited, presumably by some government entity, to ensure that the employer has complied with the obligation to have employees vaccinated. So, as I mentioned, the no job, no jab concept has really probably been overtaken by this context of mandatory requirement. Having said that, it still is my view that employers should introduce a policy dealing with vaccination and disease or virus transmission, if you like. And I say that because whilst we have COVID-19, I think over the last 20 years we've had similar, I'll call them viruses. Some have been coronaviruses, like the flu virus and the swine virus. So there has been, at least within that last 20-year period, a bit of a history of these types of viruses jumping into the human population. COVID has created the most disruption by and large of any of them. I think we have to really look to the future and perhaps foresee that there might be something even worse or at least similar around the track. Now, perhaps a bit doomsday-ish, but we've now had an exposure to COVID. In my view, I don't think we should be necessarily thinking that's the worst, or it's going to end with COVID. there's probably likely to be something else down the track. Anyway, that's perhaps a little bit off point. So, what do employers need to do? A week or so ago, the government released a mandatory vaccination timeline, I'll call it, where certain jobs and industry sectors were required to be mandated by a date, I should say. So I think in the health sector, and this is predominantly the hospital sector, and that covered private and public hospitals, 1 November, I think, was the timeline for employers to ensure that all employees had at least had one jab of a vaccination, of a 2-jab vaccination. Now, we had clients come to us and say, well, what do we need to do? Well, the requirement is to ensure that your employees have at least one vaccination by the requisite date. As I said, for health industry, predominantly hospital workers, that was 1 November. There's a secondary list, and you can get these lists from the COVID-19 WA website, by the way. If you need to have an online review of where you fit, I highly recommend you actually go to the WA COVID website. There's a fair bit of information on that website to assist employers, employees and people generally. So the second group of industries and occupations are occupations in which risk is sufficient due to high transmission, vulnerability, or necessary to avoid catastrophic risk to safety of the community. In this particular group, the first dose must be done by the 1st of December this year, and then a full vaccination by the 31st of December this year. And there's a raft of industries that have been grouped in this category: border and air transport, staff working in or entering remote Aboriginal communities. So there's a bit of crossover here in the context of agriculture and tourism, and mining and other industries, obviously. Fire and emergency services, but excluding volunteers for some reason. Abattoirs and meat processing also fall in that group. So, and then we have the third group, which is occupations deemed critical to the ongoing delivery of business and function of the community. We have things like supermarkets, grocery stores, bakers, restaurants, pubs, bars, the post office, hardware stores, etc. So that group needs their first dose by the 31st of December this year, and then fully vaccinated by the 31st of January next year. So we can see there's a pretty tight timeline on these industry groups. And it's not necessarily the case that every business will be affected with this mandatory requirement. If you don't fit within those three industry groupings, then you're in a situation where theoretically, legally, you don't have to ensure that your employees are vaccinated. I'd have to say though that once these three are out of the way, I have no doubt that the government is probably going to mandate that each and every employer, regardless of industry, will need to ensure that their employees are vaccinated. What does that mean? In the context of the questions we've been asked, and this has come out of the health sector. We've got a few clients who do work within that health environment, more in the context of services to the health sector, and allied health services as well. And so you under the no jab, no job framework that I discussed, I indicated the best approach would be to introduce a policy that had some flexibility. That flexibility around people who might have some cultural sensitivity or some medical basis for, I'll say, not having the vaccination. And it seems to me that whilst that policy makes sense, the concept of the government mandating that an employer must ensure that its employees are vaccinated cuts right across that concept of flexibility and discretion. And in my view, it cuts it across such that the employer doesn't have any discretion. The easiest example is that if you've got an employee who has simply gone to their normal GP and the GP has said this employee is not to get vaccinated, well, two things arise there. I think firstly, one is a GP letter sufficient evidence of an inability to be vaccinated. And I think we're moving to an environment where that's probably not going to be sufficient. I suspect what would be sufficient is the question of whether or not having the vaccine would seriously compromise the individual's health such that their health would deteriorate and or they would pass away, right? I think that's the sort of level we've got to in the context of a health exemption. And the second issue that I think arises there is, all right, well, you've got this employee, and let's say they truly do have a medical issue that does prevent them from having a vaccination. As an employer, you're being told by the government that you must have all your employees vaccinated. And the government is not saying some of them can be exempt. So it seems to me that a likely outcome is that employers are going to have to either isolate those particular employees that do fall within a very narrow scope for exemption from other workers within the workforce. That's one option. Another option would be to tell that employee that they can no longer be employed because of the inability, their inability to obtain vaccination, and that obviously is quite a dramatic outcome in relation to that particular employee, and indeed the employer and others within that business itself. And it's foreseeable, as we've seen over in the eastern states, where this concept of mandatory vaccinations has sort of been a bit more prevalent than in Western Australia. We've seen employees and ex-employees take their employers on for adverse action and unfair dismissal. I can't see how we're going to avoid those types of claims being raised in Western Australia at some point by someone. On this, we've also talked to other of our clients about this concept too, and the outcome of those particular claims has always, in relation to the cases we're aware of, has always fallen on the basis that the community good outweighs the individual's right. And so whilst people might be aggrieved at having to or being forced to have a vaccination, otherwise they might lose their job, and if they do then lose their job, they may well be aggrieved because they haven't been vaccinated and they've lost their job because of that. If they do take their employer on, the courts and industrial tribunals are more than most likely, I can't categorically say that they will, but are most likely to look at the weight between community safety and individual rights. And I think we're seeing through this sort of latter phases of COVID that community safety from a government's perspective and a regulator's perspective is much more valuable than individual rights. So there's some ramification I foresee in relation to employers. There's, that chestnut, should employers be put into this position in the first place? That's quite a philosophical issue. Whose role is it really to deal with the problem of disease and vaccinations within the community? And that's an interesting one when you look at perhaps some of the other diseases that you are required to be vaccinated against. I think you have measles shots and polio shots and things of that nature when you're children, and you really have no control over those things. So the job is left to your parents to obtain those vaccinations. And as I understand it too, some childcare centres won't take children if they're not vaccinated with all those things. So there's that aspect as well. So I think what I'm coming to is that the requirement for vaccination is really being brought back to an individual context in any event. It's what we sort of live with for the last 50 or so years anyway. So what are the other potential ramifications for employers? A recent case in New South Wales shed some light on that particular issue, and the case dealt with a situation where an employee of a particular company contracted the COVID-19 virus whilst on a flight out of Australia and across to the US. On entry to the health was hospitalised. Their health system collapsed. And the died from what they say was COVID-related complications. So the question in that case was a few. Was the person an employee at the time they were travelling? At work? And the third issue, which was live for a little while, is whether or not the COVID-19 virus is a disease for the purposes of the workers' compensation legislation. Now, interestingly, the definition of injury in the Workers' Compensation Act in New South Wales is very much the same, almost identical to the definition of injury under the West Australian Injury Management Workers' Compensation Act. So it, from the point of view of injury, and this is the easy one, the insurer did not argue that the disease was not an injury in relation to the relevant legislation. And if we have a look at the West Australian definition of injury, it actually captures disease as an injury. So in the sense that COVID-19 is a disease, I've checked that, I've Googled it, it is, then catching a disease whilst you're at work is something that is then compensable. The key issues in this particular case was whether the person was actually at work during the time of their flight. And the court found that the person was at work during that relevant time and hence caught the disease, if you like, during the course of that flight. So an outcome of a mandatory requirement for employees to vaccinate may well be a spike in workers' compensation claims. So I foresee that as an issue employers need to be careful about. I've also been referred to, and I can't recall now who put this, how this came about to be within my knowledge, but in New South Wales too, there has been I think it's a private members bill introduced, which is called the Public Health Amendment Vaccination Compensation Bill 2021. And I just will, take viewers to the proposed provisions. So I'm going to read this. Sorry, I think it's probably important that it all comes across. So the relevant section will apply if a relevant body, and a relevant body ipso facto is going to be referred to effectively as an employer. So the section applies where an employer requires a worker to be vaccinated against a disease, right, prescribed by the regulations, and no doubt COVID-19 would be prescribed, right? Then it says the relevant body, the employer, is liable to pay compensation to the worker for any injury, loss or damage suffered by the worker as a result of the vaccine. Right? It's not as a disease, it's a result of the vaccine. The employer continues to be liable to pay compensation to the worker until the worker's death, even if the worker ceases to be employed or otherwise engaged by the employer. So that bill was introduced in February of this year, but has not, as of early October at least, has not progressed within the Parliament over there. A couple of observations in relation to this. This is an proposed amendment to the Public Health Act in New South Wales. So I did a bit of rummaging for similar legislation in Western Australia, and you can actually find links to these things within the WA COVID-19 website as well. We also have our Public Health Act, Public Health Act 2016. And we also have an Emergency Powers Act, and I think that was 2010 or 2012. And the relevant declarations, going way back to March of last year, by the relevant ministers at that time, arose out of those two pieces of legislation. Now, as I said, I've had a bit of a rummage around the Public Health Act particularly, because that to me seems to be the one with particular relevance. And it seems to me that the Public Health Act does give the government and chief medical officers and various other people certain powers with respect to emergencies and diseases, such as what we're facing with COVID-19. It interestingly though, and I only make this as an observation, the documents produced by the government through that website, other than the relevant declarations, do not make reference to which provisions of the Public Health Act or the Emergency Powers Act that the declarations are being made under. And as I said, that's an observation. It's something that I'll probably have a bit of a look at in the near future, because we have been asked to look at the question of whether these mandatory declarations are in fact lawful. So we might come back to that at a future point in time. But suffice to say that if we have something introduced in WA, like they have in New South Wales, where the employer is liable to pay compensation to an employee who has a reaction to the vaccination, and that compensation is payable until the death of that worker, well, that raises some quite serious issues by itself, doesn't it? This is outside the workers' compensation field too, so this is just compensation per se. What is the compensation? Is it the person's salary? What does that actually comprise? Until the person dies? What if they don't die? What if they fully recover? Does compensation need to then be paid until that person dies through other means, 20, 30, 40 years later? It's perhaps, in hindsight, a little irresponsible for the person who introduced this bill to have introduced it with such questions, serious questions, still alive as to the effect and operation of provisions such as this. I'd have to hope that our government is not looking at something similar to this, or if they are, that they give it substantial more thought in relation to those particular issues and other issues as well. So that's a bright note to finish things on, I think. All right, the mandatory, just a bit of a summing up. The mandatory obligation on employers to ensure employees are vaccinated will have repercussions. That's my firm belief. Those repercussions are going to arise because some employees don't want to be vaccinated, some employees will resist it, some employees will lose their jobs, there will also need to be wary of workers' compensation claims in the context of both catching COVID-19 whilst at work, but also in the context of enforcing an obligation to vaccinate, and whether the employee reacts to the vaccination is probably going to be an interesting as to whether or not that is going to fall under the workers' compensation regime as well. So, all right, I will finish the month, but we have scheduled our next Facebook Live for the 1st of December, I think that is, or it might be the 1st of December is the Wednesday, and we're probably going to miss January. We'll all be on holiday, but then back in February. So I hope to see you again next month. Otherwise, please keep safe. And if you wish to discuss anything that I've covered today, or anything else